I love meatballs, and I know you wouldn't be watching this video if you didn't love them too.
But I'm always disappointed when I get a meatball with an overcooked exterior and a dry, hard to swallow interior. I like to make mine oven baked, which isn't a secret in the culinary world, but I have some tricks that I use while baking that will ensure a delicious, juicy meatball every time. Today I'm going to show you two different versions, a classic beef meatball made with breadcrumbs and a gluten-free lamb meatball. Then we'll throw together the amazing marinara sauce my mom used to make to go with them. Okay, I'm going to start the meatballs with one diced onion. I like to dice it fairly small so it incorporates better into the meatballs. I could use a cuisinart here, but it's only one onion, which doesn't take that long to knock out, and I'm not a big fan of cleaning the cuisinart. I'm mincing 3 cloves of garlic, which we'll saute together with that diced onion in just a minute. I'm going to finely chop a cup of parsley, a very important ingredient that will add some freshness to our meatballs. Now let's make a panade for our meatballs, which is a mixture of breadcrumbs and milk. I'm going to use French bread here. This is the classical way to add some starch, which will give the fat something to hold on to, preserving our moisture and introducing some texture. Through trial and error, I found a little panade goes a long way, so I only do a quarter cup of breadcrumbs to a quarter cup of milk, which is enough to achieve the results I'm looking for. I'll stir the milk into the breadcrumbs and leave that for at least 15 minutes to give the milk a chance to soak into the breadcrumbs while I saute our onions and garlic. I like to cook the onions for a couple minutes until they're basically translucent, and then I'm going to add the garlic and saute that for about another minute or so. Now it's time for the herbs. I'm using fresh today, and I have about 2 tablespoons of basil and 2 tablespoons of oregano. After we've incorporated that, I'm going to add the cup of fresh parsley. Alright, my panade is looking good. All the milk has been absorbed. Let's add our sauteed onion and herb mix and a quarter cup of grated parmesan, but this is optional. A couple teaspoons of salt, 1 teaspoon per pound of meat is a good rule of thumb, and 1 teaspoon of black pepper. I have 1 egg, which will give our meatballs structure and add a little bit of more richness. Mix it up good, and now it's time for the meat. I'm using 2 pounds of ground chuck here, which is one of my favorite cuts for meatballs. I'm mixing this together nice and lightly so the meatballs don't get too compact and dense. Let's preheat the oven to 450 degrees. While I'm forming the meatballs, I'm also loosely packing them, which will give them a more tender and less compact mouthfeel. Now for the secret ingredient. I'm going to use approximately 1/3 of a cup of chicken stock, basically surrounding the meatballs. This will steam up and keep the exterior of our meatballs moist while they're roasting at a very high 450-degree temperature, creating a brown, crispy exterior. We are essentially lightly braising these balls. Alright, let's pop those in the oven and set a timer for approximately 15 minutes. Depending on the size you make your meatballs, it might take a little less time or a little more to reach our desired internal temperature of 135 degrees. And there they are, our lovely juicy nuggets of love. I'm going to use a thermometer to make sure we're in the desired temperature range of around 135 degrees. There's going to be some carryover cooking of about 5 degrees, so these will be at a perfect medium temperature. Let's cut one of these open and take a look, and I'll show you just how moist these are on the inside. Now that's a juicy meatball. I know, according to the FDA, we're supposed to cook ground meat to 160 degrees, and if I were using ground pork, I would shoot for 160. With any kind of poultry, I would bring the finished temperature up to 165 degrees. The reason we do this is to cook off any harmful bacteria that might make us sick. Mainly this extra precaution is taken because any bacteria on the outside of the cut of beef is spread throughout the meat during the grinding process. But this is not the case when cooking a steak because the surface bacteria is safely killed while we sear the exterior of the meat. Also, when you're buying prepackaged ground beef at the grocery store, you're not just buying the beef from one cow. It's likely been sourced from multiple cows, which increases the chance for contamination. So ask your butcher if their ground beef is single sourced, meaning they're not using multiple cows in the finished product. One way I like to alleviate some of the risk is picking out one of my favorite cuts like a chuck roast or short ribs and have the butcher grind it for me while I'm there. Then I cook it that day to reduce the risk of bacteria growing over time.
So when you go to a restaurant, do you order your hamburgers well done? Well, if you do, then cook your meatballs to 160 degrees. But if you like your burgers like I do, somewhere between medium rare and medium, I would shoot for more like 135 to 140 degrees with your meatballs.
I'm a personal chef and fortunate enough to live here in beautiful Santa Barbara, California, and it's not easy concentrating on cooking when these are the views from your kitchen. I have a gluten-free client that orders lamb meatballs almost every week, so I started using gluten-free breadcrumbs, but was out of them one day and decided to do it without. Turns out she liked them even better. I know. Meatballs are traditionally supposed to have breadcrumbs in them, otherwise it's just a glorified miniature hamburger. But I'm going to replace the breadcrumbs with finely chopped zucchini, which will help keep the moisture, add some flavor, and create a bit of separation in the meat. The preparation is similar with a slightly higher finishing temperature due to the larger concentration of fat in the lamb versus the beef. I'm starting by cutting the outside off the zucchini where most of the flavor is, and I'm using one onion. We'll cut these all into smaller pieces so they'll blend well in the Cuisinart. I'm going to pulse this a few times until I reach a finely chopped consistency. That looks about right. Okay, let's start with some olive oil. We're cooking here with a medium-high flame. I'll saute this for a bit until the zucchini and onion looks fairly translucent and the moisture is cooked away. Then I'm going to add 3 cloves of chopped garlic. I don't have fresh herbs on hand for this batch, so I'll add 1 tablespoon of dry oregano and 1 tablespoon of dry basil. Because dry herbs have a greater concentration of flavor, I usually use about half as much as I would if it were fresh. I'll incorporate those in and then transfer everything over to a mixing bowl. Here I'm going to add 1 egg to bind and 1 cup fresh chopped parsley, same as our last recipe. A couple teaspoons salt and a teaspoon of fresh cracked pepper. It's time for the lamb. I have 2 pounds here. Let's lightly fold that into the rest of our ingredients. Oops, you didn't see that. I forgot to combine our ingredients before I added the lamb. Let's pull that out and give everything a good mix. That looks good. Alright, let's try that again. Gently combine everything together until it's just mixed. Preheat the oven again to 450 degrees. Okay, let's knock these out the same way we did last time, rolling them into balls without overpacking them. Now I'm adding my secret ingredient. About 1/3 of a cup of chicken stock that's going to keep the outside of the meatballs from drying out and add a bit of flavor. Alright, in you go. I'm going to set a timer for 15 minutes. They might take a little more than that, but that's a good start. And here we go. Those look good to me. Wonderful, savory, succulent spheres of love. I'm going to tempt these now, and I'm looking for a slightly higher temperature because of the greater fat content. So I'm shooting for about 140 degrees. After carryover cooking, they should finish at 145 degrees. That looks great. Let's cut one open and take a look. These are a bit more compact than the last batch without the breadcrumbs, but as you can see, extremely juicy. All right, I need a sauce to go with these balls. Let's whip up a quick marinara. We'll get rid of that root, and let's finely chop 1 onion. And then we're going to mince 3 cloves of garlic. I decided to skip the Cuisinart here because it doesn't do a very good job mincing the garlic with only a few cloves, and I can dice an onion pretty quick. Let's coat the pan with olive oil and cook those onions on medium-high heat. I'm going to stir those around until they're basically translucent, and then I'm going to add our 3 cloves of minced garlic. We'll saute those for a minute or two. And now it's time for some herbs. I have 1 tablespoon of dry oregano. I like to add my dry herbs in the beginning of the sauce when I'm sauteing my aromatics to release as much flavor as possible. This is going to be a quick tomato sauce, which means I'm not planning on simmering it very long. If we're doing a long, slow simmer sauce for a few hours, I would add all of my herbs towards the end of the cooking process, or I might cook away too much of their flavor. Time for about 2 tablespoons of tomato paste. Let's saute that at a slightly lower medium temperature, stirring it frequently until it starts to brown up a bit. Now I'm going to add a cup of red wine to deglaze the pan and add an extra dimension of flavor to my sauce. Oh yeah! I'm reducing that wine down until it's at least halfway evaporated. Now I'm going to add my tomatoes. I like to use whole peeled tomatoes, and one of my favorite brands is Moody. I also like Cento, or you could use your favorite brand. Some tomato companies use calcium chloride to help the tomatoes stay firm, but I found it gives them a weird texture and takes a lot longer to break down if you're making a sauce. Neither Moody or Cento contain calcium chloride, but Cento adds some citric acid for a preservative. I'm going to add 2 28-ounce cans, and then I like to break them down by hand, leaving a few big chunks so it feels a bit more homemade.
Oh man,
I had better results with that last time.
that didn't work.
Oh well, we'll come back to that later. I'm adding some fresh cracked pepper and a couple pinches of salt. We can always add some more later. And a couple pinches of sugar. This will take away that acidic flavor from our tomatoes and smooth everything out. A pinch of baking soda would do the same thing here, but it's a lot easier to overdo it with the soda, and I always feel like I have a better result when I use a little sugar. I'll stir that in and bring everything to a simmer. Okay, let's try breaking down these tomatoes again. I have a few options, starting with the potato masher, or I could use this wire whisk. But let's be real, I'm fairly lazy and I have a hand mixer which will do an equally good job. I had the fresh basil on hand, so I'm doing 2 tablespoons of that and about 1 cup of fresh chopped parsley. My mom used to always say lots of fresh parsley was the secret ingredient to her marinara sauce. I'll bring that back to a simmer, and it's time for a pinch of crushed red pepper to offset the sweetness. Here's another secret that I learned from my mom, a little bit of beef stock. I'm using a 1/4 cup here. This will add another dimension of flavor just like the red wine. Stir that in and bring it back to a simmer, and now it's time for the meatballs. I really only need to simmer these for about 5 minutes just to warm them up. Remember, I'm trying not to overcook these and end up with a dry interior. Time for the pasta. I like to toss my pasta in a little bit of the sauce before I plate it up. And I like to eat a lot of pasta. That should do it. With this size of meatball, I think 3 is sufficient. Finish it with a little more sauce on top, and that's it. Top with some freshly grated parmesan and some more of that fresh parsley. And there it is. Now we couldn't make meatballs without throwing together a meatball sandwich. You can warm up your meatballs right in the marinara sauce. I like to use a toasted ciabatta roll with some of our delicious marinara, topped with the fresh mozzarella and parmesan. I put the whole sandwich in the oven under a low temperature broiler for a few minutes until the cheese is melted. Alright, let's slice that bad boy in half and take a look. Okay, I'm getting hungry. I think it's time to finally eat.